Somewhere over the Arctic Sea, in the summer of 1928, a small plane vanished without a sound. It carried 6 men and the most famous polar explorer alive. No wreck was ever recovered, and no bodies were ever found. Months later, a float and a broken fuel tank washed ashore on a northern coast. That was all the ocean returned of a man who had beaten the world to both ends of the earth. He had stood at the bottom of the planet and later looked down on the top of it. So why did he fly north one last time toward a place he already knew could kill him? To understand that, you have to imagine a world with 2 blank spaces left on the map. For centuries, sailors had pushed into the ice of the far north, searching for a passage to Asia. Ships went in with full crews and came out with fewer, or never came out at all. One British expedition disappeared entirely, and the search for its lost men became a legend of its own. The Arctic was not a route. It was a graveyard with a rumor of a door. At the other end of the world lay a continent of ice larger than Europe. Its interior had never been seen by human eyes. Maps simply stopped, and the emptiness beyond them was left white. Into that emptiness came a young Norwegian who had made a quiet decision as a boy. He read the accounts of failed expeditions and, instead of being frightened, he felt something like hunger. He slept with his bedroom windows open through the Norwegian winter to harden himself against cold. He walked and skied for days in the mountains, treating his own body as equipment to be tested. He understood something most explorers of his time refused to accept. The ice did not reward courage. It rewarded preparation. So he learned from the people who had lived on ice for thousands of years. He studied how Inuit hunters dressed in loose furs that carried away sweat instead of trapping it. He learned to drive dogs, to build snow shelters, to move slowly enough to stay dry. Other men brought engines and wool and pride into the Arctic, and many of them died wearing them. If stories of human limits and impossible journeys hold your attention, consider subscribing to Wonders and Frontiers. His first great gamble began in the dark, with a debt he could not pay. Creditors were closing in on his small ship, and one of them threatened to stop the voyage. Some accounts say he slipped out of harbor at midnight, in the rain, without permission. The ship was tiny, barely larger than a fishing boat, with a crew of 7. Ahead of it lay the passage that had swallowed better-funded ships for 400 years. They pushed west through channels choked with floating ice, feeling the hull shudder with every strike. Then winter arrived, and the sea turned to stone around them. For nearly 2 years they lived in that frozen harbor, and those years became his real education. Inuit families camped beside them, and he watched everything they did. He wrote down how they cut snow blocks, how they fed their dogs, how they read the wind. When the ice finally released the ship, they slipped through the last narrow water and out into the Pacific. The passage that had defeated centuries of explorers had been crossed by 7 men and a converted herring boat. But his ambition had already moved to a bigger prize. He wanted the North Pole, and he had spent years preparing for it. Then news came that other men claimed to have reached it first. In a single moment, the goal of his life became worthless. What he did next, he kept almost entirely to himself. He told his crew only after they were at sea, and he told the world by telegram. He was not going north. He was going south. Somewhere ahead, a British expedition was already moving toward the same pole. Neither side had agreed to a race, and yet a race had begun. His ship pushed through the southern pack ice and stopped against a wall of floating ice. He made a decision that experienced men called reckless. He built his base on the ice shelf itself, on ground that could break away and drift into the sea. But it put him 60 miles closer to the pole than any rival. Through the long polar night they waited, in a hut buried by drifting snow. Outside, the temperature fell far below anything a human body can tolerate unprotected. Inside, men mended boots and weighed rations and argued about the fastest way to travel. He counted everything: biscuits, dog food, matches, miles. He laid supply depots far to the south and marked them with lines of flags so they could not be missed. One early start almost destroyed the expedition, when they left too soon and the cold nearly killed the dogs. He turned back, swallowing his pride, and waited for the season to turn. Some of his men never forgave the way that retreat was handled. When they set out again, 5 men and 52 dogs moved south across the shelf. The ice hid crevasses deep enough to swallow a sledge and everything tied to it. Then a mountain range rose out of the horizon, blocking the road to the plateau. There were no maps, no known passes, only a wall of rock and glacier. They chose a glacier and climbed it, hauling sledges up 10,000 feet of broken ice. At the top, they did what the plan required, and what most of them dreaded. Many of the dogs were shot, and the survivors were fed on them. He wrote about that day with unusual honesty, calling it the hardest part of the whole journey. Then came the plateau, flat and blinding and silent, with a wind that never stopped. Every mile now was a mile no living thing had ever crossed. On a gray December afternoon, the sledge meters told them they had arrived. There was nothing to see. No monument, no landmark, only white ground meeting white sky. They planted a flag together, 5 hands on the staff, because he refused to claim the moment alone. They stayed 3 days, taking measurements and circling the area to be certain of their position. Then they left a small tent behind, with a letter inside addressed to the men they believed were coming. It was a courtesy, and it became one of the saddest documents in exploration. The British party arrived a month later, found the tent, and understood everything in an instant. None of them survived the return. He reached his ship with every man alive and almost every calculation proven right. And yet the world's admiration was complicated forever by the graves left behind on that same ice. Victory did not settle him. It never had. Years later, he returned to the north, this time in the air. He crossed the Arctic Ocean in an airship and looked down at the pole he had once been denied. Beneath him lay the ice that had shaped his entire life, reduced to a pattern of cracks and shadow. He said afterwards that the Arctic would be his home and that he wanted to die there. When word came that a rival's airship had crashed on the ice, he did not hesitate. The man he flew to rescue had insulted him publicly for years. He went anyway, in an aircraft poorly suited to the Arctic, and disappeared into fog. What remains unclear is what happened in those final minutes above the sea. Historians still debate the ice, the fuel, and the weather reports he chose to ignore. Perhaps he already knew that a man like him does not grow old in a warm room. He had spent his life turning the unknown into a map, and the last blank space on it was his own ending. Somewhere under the cold water of the far north, the search is still, in a sense, unfinished. For more journeys to the edges of the map and the people who never came back from them, stay with Wonders and Frontiers.